If you want to understand power, follow information. Throughout history, armies have risen and fallen, empires have expanded and collapsed, and technologies have come and gone. But beneath all of it runs a quieter force, the way ideas move. Across the last 1700 years, power has reorganized itself again and again, not simply because of wars or rulers, but because information learned how to travel in new ways. Sacred texts, local authority, printed pages, electrical signals. Each created a different structure of society and a different kind of power. The challenge is that this story unfolds across an enormous span of time, far too large to grasp all at once. In this video, we'll make that history readable. We'll use a method of temporal compression to break a 1700-year timeline into meaningful segments, and we'll trace how changes in information distribution reshaped power from the Nicene Creed to the modern signal-driven world of today. The challenges of studying history. History is difficult to study not because there is too little information, but because there is too much, and because what we have is uneven, incomplete, and deeply narrative. Every historical period is recorded by people with perspectives, incentives, and blind spots. Victors write chronicles. Institutions preserve what supports them. Entire cultures disappear without leaving records at all. What survives is often propaganda, interpretation, or fragments reconstructed long after the fact. On top of that, hindsight changes everything. Once we know how events turned out, it becomes tempting to read inevitability into the past, to imagine that outcomes were obvious or necessary. But history did not unfold as a clean chain of causes. It unfolded as lived experience, full of uncertainty, false starts, and forgotten alternatives. This is one reason why applying a science-style analysis to history is so difficult. In the natural sciences, we learn by isolating variables. We control conditions, we repeat experiments, we adjust one parameter at a time. None of that is possible in history. You cannot isolate economics from belief, or technology from geography, or personality from circumstance. Every historical moment is shaped by all of these at once. Historical causality is entangled, not separable. Then, there is the problem of scale. When we look across centuries, treating every year as equally important quickly produces noise. The timeline becomes crowded with dates, names, and events that blur together without meaning. But if we swing too far in the other direction, focusing only on a handful of major events, we lose the slow structural forces that made those events possible in the first place. History either becomes overwhelming or it becomes oversimplified. Skilled historians solve this problem by changing how they look at time itself. Rather than treating all periods evenly, they zoom. They compress long stretches where change is slow, and they expand periods where change accelerates. They look for the underlying systems that organize entire eras: religion, information technology, economic structure, and they let those systems guide how much detail each period receives. This approach does not eliminate complexity. It makes complexity legible. It allows patterns to emerge across centuries without flattening history into a list of dates or anecdotes. And it is this technique, the deliberate compression and expansion of time, that will allow us to tell a coherent story about how ideas shaped power over the last 1700 years. The 4-3-2-1 method of temporal compression. When historians look at very long stretches of time, they face a fundamental problem. Not all parts of history deserve the same level of attention. Some centuries change very little, while others completely reshape the world. Treating every year equally produces noise rather than insight. To deal with this, historians use a technique called temporal compression, the deliberate decision to compress distant time and expand more recent time so that long histories become readable. One particularly elegant version of this idea comes from an ancient Indian intuition about time, found in the doctrine of the yugas. In that system, history is divided into 4 eras of unequal length. The Satya Yuga lasts 4 times as long as the Kali Yuga. The Treta Yuga lasts 3 times as long. The Dvapara Yuga lasts twice as long. And the Kali Yuga is the shortest. What matters for us is not the mythology, but the structure. 4 eras in the ratio 4 to 3 to 2 to 1. When you add those numbers together, 4 plus 3 plus 2 plus 1, you get 10. That means this method is mathematically equivalent to taking any time interval, dividing it into 10 equal parts, and then grouping those parts sequentially into 4 unequal segments. In modern terms, this becomes the 40-30-20-10 rule. 40% of the time spans goes to the earliest era, 30% to the next, 20% to the next, and the final 10% to the most recent era. This structure captures something deeply intuitive. The closer events are to the present, the less compressed they should be. Recent history contains more information, more sources, more consequences that are still unfolding. Distant history, by contrast, often moves slowly and can be understood through broad structural patterns rather than fine detail. This method allows us to decompose a finite historical interval, identify meaningful date ranges, and craft a narrative that is proportional to how history actually unfolds. The process itself is straightforward and reusable. First, we identify a historically significant event. We'll call this event E. This event should mark a real transformation in how ideas, power, or institutions are organized. Second, we calculate the time interval between that event and the present. Let T be the total number of years from E to today. Third, we compute the temporal thresholds using fixed percentages of that interval. The first threshold is E plus 0.4t. The second is E plus 0.7t, which is 40% plus 30%. The third is E plus 0.9t, which adds another 20%. And the final endpoint is the present. This gives us 4 sequential subintervals, from E to E plus 0.4t, from E plus 0.4t to E plus 0.7t, from E plus 0.7t to E plus 0.9t, and from E plus 0.9t to today. Each of these subintervals should reveal a deeper layer of the original cause introduced by the anchor event. The key idea is that temporal compression is not about distorting history. It's about distributing attention intelligently. It allows us to see long-term causality without flattening everything into a list of dates. In the rest of this video, we'll apply this method step by step, starting with a single historical event, calculating the full time span, and then using the 4-3-2-1 structure to reveal how changes in information distribution reshaped power over the last 1700 years. Applying the 4-3-2-1 method to our historical case. Now that we understand the 4-3-2-1 method of temporal compression, the next step is to apply it to a real historical case. Every use of this method begins with a single anchor event, a moment that marks a fundamental shift in how ideas are organized, legitimized, or distributed. For this video, that anchor event is the Nicene Creed, established in the year 325 AD. The Nicene Creed matters because it represents a decisive moment of standardization. It formalized Christian doctrine across the Roman world and laid the foundation for a centralized authority over belief, interpretation, and legitimacy. From this point forward, scripture, doctrine, and institutional interpretation become tightly linked to political and cultural power in Europe. So we designate this event as E. The next step is to calculate the total time interval between that event and the present. We take the present year to be 2025. Subtracting 325 from 2025 gives us a total interval of 1700 years. This is our value T. With T defined, we can now apply the temporal decomposition. 40% of 1700 years is 680 years. Adding that to 325 gives us the year 1005. 70% of 1700 years is 1190 years. Adding that to 325 gives us the year 1515. 90% of 1700 years is 1530 years. Adding that to 325 gives us the year 1855. These calculations divide the full interval from 325 to 2025 into 4 sequential subintervals. The first runs from 325 to 1005. The second from 1005 to 1515. The third from 1515 to 1855. And the fourth from 1855 to the present. What matters here is not just the arithmetic, but what these boundaries reveal. Each cut point corresponds to a real shift in how information moves through society, and therefore how power is structured. Using this method, we can now name each interval according to its dominant information regime. From 325 to 1005, we have sovereign scripture, a world ruled by sacred texts and church authority. From 1005 to 1515, we enter marvelous Manors, a world fragmented into feudal localities where information is local, slow, and geographically bounded. From 1515 to 1855, we move into paper power, a world transformed by printing, rising literacy, and the emergence of secular government. And from 1855 to 2025, we arrive at signal society, a world electrified by telecommunications, where ideas move at the speed of light. Now that the timeline has been decomposed and the four eras identified, we can examine each one in turn, beginning with the first and longest interval, where power flows through scripture, institutions, and sacred authority. Sovereign scripture, 325 to 1005. The first and longest interval in our timeline runs from the year 325 to the year 1005. This is the era we call sovereign scripture. In this period, power is inseparable from sacred text. Ideas move slowly, literacy is rare, and the written word is treated not merely as information, but as authority itself. The Nicene Creed marks the beginning of this era because it establishes a unified doctrine at the heart of Christianity. From that moment on, belief is no longer purely local or plural. It becomes standardized, codified, and guarded by an institution whose authority rests on its exclusive ability to interpret sacred texts. During this era, books are extraordinarily scarce. Every manuscript must be copied by hand. Producing a single Bible can take months or even years of labor. As a result, texts are precious, fragile, and tightly controlled. This scarcity creates a powerful bottleneck. Only a small, educated elite can read. Fewer still can interpret scripture in Latin, and almost no one outside the church has access to original texts at all. The church, therefore, becomes the primary information authority of Europe. Monasteries function as the data centers of their age. Scriptoria, rooms where monks painstakingly copy manuscripts, preserve religious texts, classical philosophy, legal codes, and historical records. But preservation is not neutral. To copy a text is also to select it, frame it, and interpret it. What is preserved survives. What is not disappears. The church does not merely transmit ideas, it filters them. Theology becomes the lens through which reality is understood. Political legitimacy flows through religious sanction. Moral authority is grounded in scripture. Even kings rule by divine right. This creates a world where power flows vertically. Ideas move downward from institutions to people, not laterally between individuals. The structure of authority mirrors the structure of information distribution. Centralized, hierarchical, and slow. Change in this era is correspondingly gradual. New ideas spread at the pace of travel and copying. Innovations are absorbed cautiously. Doctrinal disputes take generations to resolve. The rhythm of history is slow and steady. This is why this first segment receives the greatest temporal compression. Over nearly 7 centuries, the basic information regime remains stable. Sacred text, guarded interpretation, and institutional authority dominate the landscape. What matters here is not individual events, but the foundation that is laid. A civilization is built around the assumption that truth is fixed, revelation is complete, and authority flows from those entrusted with the word. But this structure contains the seeds of its own transformation. As populations grow, as trade expands, and as local power structures develop, information begins to strain against centralized control. And that pressure leads us into the next era, one where power becomes more local, information becomes more fragmented, and authority is no longer unified under a single institutional voice. That next world is the world of marvelous Manors. Marvelous Manors, 1005 to 1515. The second interval in our timeline runs from the year 1005 to 1515. This is the era we call marvelous Manors. If the previous era was defined by centralized sacred authority, this one is defined by fragmentation. Power becomes local, Information becomes geographically bounded, and most people's understanding of the world shrinks to the distance they can physically travel. During this period, Europe is organized into feudal systems. Land is divided among lords, each ruling a manor or a cluster of villages. Political authority is personal and territorial rather than centralized. And crucially, information follows the same structure. Most people never leave the region where they are born. Roads are poor, travel is dangerous, and long-distance communication is slow and unreliable. There are no newspapers, no broadcasts, no mass reproduction of texts. What people know about the world comes from a very small set of sources: the local lord, the local priest, and the occasional traveler or messenger. This creates a patchwork of information bubbles. Reality is not universal, it is local. News travels by word of mouth. Rumors persist for generations. Customs vary widely from region to region, even when populations nominally share the same religion. The church still exists, and it still matters. But its authority is now filtered through local power structures. The priest answers to the bishop, but the peasant answers to the Lord. Land ownership, protection, and food security dominate everyday life far more than distant theological debates. In this world, power flows horizontally across geography rather than vertically from a single institution. Control over land becomes control over people, and control over people becomes control over information. The Lord decides what news enters the manor, which laws are enforced, and which traditions are upheld. Feudalism, in this sense, is not just an economic system. It is an information system. It limits how far ideas can travel and how fast they can spread. It reinforces hierarchy by isolating communities from one another. Change still happens, but it happens unevenly. Innovations appear in one region and take centuries to reach another. Political developments in one kingdom may be completely unknown just a few hundred miles away. History advances in pockets rather than waves. This is why this era occupies the next 30% of the timeline. Compared to the age of sovereign scripture, change is more dynamic. Power is less centralized. Social structures are more varied. But information is still slow, scarce, and tightly bounded by geography. What matters most in this era is not ideology, but proximity. Who you serve depends on where you live. What you believe depends on who speaks to you. Authority is not universal truth, but local enforcement. Yet even this fragmented system cannot hold forever. Trade expands, cities grow, universities emerge, and quietly a technological innovation begins to form, one that will break geographic information barriers entirely. That innovation is mechanical printing, and with it begins the next era. Paper power, 1515 to 1855. The third interval in our timeline runs from 1515 to 1855. This is the era we call paper power. If the previous era was defined by local control and geographic isolation, this one is defined by a single transformation. Ideas become mechanically reproducible. The invention of the printing press changes everything. For the first time in European history, information is no longer copied one manuscript at a time. It can be reproduced in thousands of identical copies and distributed far beyond its point of origin. This fundamentally alters the relationship between ideas and authority. One of the most consequential moments in this transition is the translation of the Bible into vernacular languages. When William Tyndale translates scripture into English, he does more than make a religious text accessible. He breaks the monopoly on interpretation that had sustained both church and feudal authority for centuries. People can now read for themselves. They can compare texts, they can argue about meaning, and crucially, they can do so without requiring direct approval from religious or political elites. Printing turns ideas into objects that can travel independently of their authors. Pamphlets, books, newspapers, and journals begin circulating through cities, universities, and marketplaces. Literacy rises. Public debate becomes possible at scale. This shift gives rise to entirely new institutions. Scientific societies emerge, built around printed journals and shared methods. Legal systems expand, grounded in written statutes rather than personal decree. Bureaucratic states develop, relying on paperwork, record-keeping, and standardized administration. Power, in this era, is no longer grounded primarily in land or sacred authority. It is grounded in documentation. Whoever controls printing, publishing, and record keeping gains influence over law, education, commerce, and governance. This is also the era in which secular government takes shape. Authority increasingly derives from constitutions, parliaments, and legal codes rather than divine sanction. These structures are inseparable from print. They depend on the ability to disseminate laws, circulate arguments, and maintain consistent records across large populations. But paper power has limits. Printing accelerates ideas, but it does not make them instantaneous. News still travels at the speed of ships and horses. Political coordination takes weeks or months. Authority is broader than before, but still slow by modern standards. Nevertheless, the effect is cumulative. Over these 3 centuries, printed information reshapes education, religion, science, and politics. The public sphere expands. Individuals begin to see themselves as citizens rather than subjects. Change accelerates. Causality becomes clearer, institutions multiply, the mechanisms of power grow more explicit. And yet, even this world of paper is about to be overtaken. In the mid-19th century, information will escape the physical limits of print altogether. Ideas will begin to move faster than human travel, faster even than human speech. That transformation marks the beginning of the final era in our timeline. Signal Society, 1855 to 2025. The final interval in our timeline runs from 1855 to the present. This is the era we call Signal Society. What defines this era is simple but profound. Information becomes detached from physical transport. Ideas no longer move at the speed of horses, ships, or printed pages. They move at the speed of electricity. The first major break comes with the telegraph. For the first time in human history, a message can travel faster than a person. Distance collapses. A signal sent in one city can be received almost instantly in another, hundreds or thousands of miles away. This marks a fundamental shift in power. Coordination no longer depends on proximity. Markets can synchronize across continents. Governments can issue commands in real time. Military, financial, and political authority become increasingly centralized around communication infrastructure. The telephone deepens this transformation. Information is no longer just transmitted, it becomes conversational. Decisions can be made live across distance without intermediaries. Organizations expand in scale because communication can keep up with complexity. Then comes radio. Radio introduces mass broadcast, one voice speaking to millions simultaneously. This creates a new form of power, persuasion at scale. National identities, political movements, and cultural norms can now be shaped through sound alone. Leaders speak directly into homes. Narratives become synchronized across entire populations. Politics becomes inseparable from media presence. Reality itself begins to feel mediated. Synthesis. The stack of power. Across the last 1700 years, we traced 4 major information regimes: sovereign scripture, marvelous manners, paper power, and signal society. Each one reshaped how ideas moved, and in doing so, reshaped how power was organized. It's important to be precise about what this means. These eras do not replace one another. They accumulate. In the modern world, all 4 systems are still operating at the same time. What has changed is which one dominates. Sacred authority never disappeared. Religious institutions and moral traditions still shape identity, culture, and political behavior. Sacred texts continue to function as sources of legitimacy and meaning for millions of people. Sovereign scripture remains a powerful force. Local power structures never vanished either. They persist through politics, bureaucracy, and social hierarchy. Geography still matters. Access to resources, enforcement, and opportunity is still mediated by local institutions and elites. The logic of the manor survives inside the modern state. Paper power is everywhere. Laws, contracts, credentials, records, and formal procedures still govern everyday life. Courts, governments, universities, and corporations all depend on written documentation. Authority still flows through what is printed, archived, and officially recorded. What is new is the dominance of signal society. In the modern era, attention itself becomes a central resource. Influence increasingly flows through networks, platforms, and algorithms. Visibility can matter more than position. Persuasion can move faster than institutions can respond. Internet influencers, broadcasters, and digital platforms now shape belief at scale, often outside traditional structures of authority. Modern power is therefore layered. It is a stack. The church, the manor, the document, and the signal all exert influence simultaneously. The value of the 4-3-2-1 temporal compression method is that it makes this stack visible. By compressing slow-moving foundations and expanding fast-moving mechanisms, it allows us to see how each layer formed and why they still matter. To understand power today, we don't just ask who rules. We ask how ideas move, which layers dominate, and where influence actually flows. Because history does not disappear, it accumulates. And whatever comes next will not erase this structure. It will simply add another layer on top.